The courtroom was alive with its usual energy. Attorneys flipping through case files, the low murmur of voices from the gallery, and the faint clatter of a stenographer setting up her machine. Judge Vivian Carter adjusted her glasses and glanced at the docket for the day. It was a routine set of cases, nothing particularly unusual. That was, until the bailiff called the next name. Defendant Daniel Rivers, the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. Vivian's gavel, poised in midair, froze. Her chest tightened as she looked up, her gaze locking onto the man standing at the defendant's table. For a moment, it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. It was Daniel. His hair, now peppered with strands of gray, framed a face that had grown more angular over the years. Yet those eyes, sharp, determined, and laced with a quiet sorrow, were unmistakably his. Memories surged like a tidal wave, dragging her back to long summer afternoons in Brookhaven, Mississippi. Brookhaven was a town steeped in unspoken rules and rigid divides. Vivian and Daniel had defied those divides as children, finding solace in each other's company. They had shared dreams, laughter, and a secret hope that the world could be better. But life had torn them apart, and seeing him now, in this context, felt like a cruel twist of fate. Vivian forced herself to focus. This wasn't the time for personal reflection. "How does the defendant plead?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. Daniel's lawyer, a young woman with a poised demeanor, rose. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Vivian nodded and motioned for the proceedings to continue. But her mind kept returning to the boy she once knew. How had Daniel ended up here, accused of robbery and assault? The weight of her judicial robe felt heavier than ever as she grappled with the surreal collision of her past and present. The past unfolded in vivid snapshots in Vivian's mind, pulling her away from the sterile courtroom and back into the lush, sun-soaked fields of Brookhaven. As a child, she had been drawn to Daniel's unyielding spirit. While other children played within the confines of their segregated neighborhoods, Vivian and Daniel had found refuge in a hidden clearing by the creek. They spent hours there, crafting grandiose plans to leave their small town. Daniel would talk about becoming a musician, his voice carrying dreams of jazz-filled nights in New Orleans. Vivian, with her love for books, aspired to become a lawyer and fight for justice. Their bond had been a rebellion against the societal expectations that tried to cage them. But rebellion has its limits, especially in a town like Brookhaven. Their friendship had drawn whispers, then outright condemnation. Vivian's father, a strict man with an unwavering adherence to societal norms, had discovered their secret meeting place. "Vivian, you will not see him again," he had thundered, his voice echoing in their modest kitchen. "Do you understand me?" Tears had stung Vivian's eyes as she pleaded with him, but it was no use. The next day, Daniel's family had packed up and left town under the cover of night, hounded by a scandal they hadn't asked for. Vivian had stood at her bedroom window, watching the taillights of their truck fade into the distance, taking with them her closest friend and the first person who had truly understood her. Years passed. Vivian buried herself in her studies, driven by a desire to escape Brookhaven's oppressive grasp. She graduated top of her class, went to law school, and eventually donned the black robes of a judge. But in quiet moments, she would think of Daniel, wondering what became of him. Now, sitting in her courtroom, the answer was before her. Daniel's life had been anything but smooth, and the scars of systemic injustice were etched into his face. She struggled to keep her emotions in check, knowing that the decisions she made in this trial could alter his life yet again. As the day's proceedings continued, Vivian caught glimpses of Daniel out of the corner of her eye. He sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him, an air of quiet dignity surrounding him. She couldn't help but wonder if he recognized her. And if he did, what would he see? The girl who had once been his friend, or the judge who now held his fate in her hands? The trial began under the stark fluorescent lights of the courtroom, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Vivian sat straight-backed at the bench, her face an unreadable mask, as the prosecution laid out its case against Daniel Rivers. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and sharper words, began. "The evidence will show that the defendant, Daniel Rivers, assaulted a store clerk during an armed robbery at Johnson's Grocery on the night of August 14th. The prosecution will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this man committed the crime. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the system worked exactly as intended. His words painted Daniel as a dangerous man, a career criminal who had finally been caught. Vivian's stomach churned at the picture being drawn. The stark contrast between the prosecutor's version of Daniel and the boy she had known. The prosecutor called his first witness, the store clerk, who sat nervously in the witness stand. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, with wide eyes that darted around the courtroom as if looking for an escape. "Tell us what happened that night," the prosecutor prompted. The clerk hesitated, licking his lips before answering. "It was just before closing. A man came in wearing a red hoodie. He pulled a knife and told me to empty the register. I was scared, so I did what he said. After he took the money, he shoved me and ran out." "And can you identify the man who robbed you?" The clerk glanced nervously toward Daniel. I think it was him," he stammered, his voice wavering. Vivian's gaze flicked to Daniel, who sat impassively, his hands folded neatly on the table. There was no reaction, no outburst of anger or indignation, only a calm stillness that somehow made him appear more vulnerable. The prosecutor moved on to the surveillance footage, grainy black and white images that showed a man in a red hoodie entering the store. The video was unclear, the figure's face obscured by the hood's shadow. Still, the prosecution argued that the resemblance to Daniel was unmistakable. As the evidence mounted, Vivian found herself torn. The facts presented by the prosecution seemed compelling, but they didn't align with the Daniel she remembered. She fought to keep her emotions in check, knowing that any sign of bias could undermine the integrity of the trial. The atmosphere shifted as Maya Thompson, Daniel's defense attorney, stood to address the jury. Her presence was commanding despite her youth, her words carefully chosen and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, what the prosecution has presented today is not evidence of guilt. It is speculation, built on shaky testimony and unclear footage," she began, her voice steady and resolute. She wasted no time in cross-examining the store clerk, who squirmed under her precise and pointed questions. "You said the man was wearing a red hoodie, correct?" Maya asked, her tone calm but firm. "Yes," the clerk replied hesitantly. "And yet, when police searched Mr. Rivers' home, they didn't find a red hoodie. Isn't that correct?" The clerk blinked, clearly taken aback. "I don't know." Maya turned to the jury. "Let's consider this carefully. The only physical description we have of the suspect is this red hoodie, and yet no such hoodie was ever recovered. The prosecution asks you to rely on a hunch, not hard evidence." She moved on to the surveillance footage, which was displayed once more on the courtroom monitors. Maya pointed to the blurry figure in the video. "Does this look like a definitive identification to you?" she asked the jury. "Can any of you say, with absolute certainty, that this is Daniel Rivers? Or is this merely a shadow, a figure the prosecution has conveniently decided to pin on my client?" The courtroom was silent, the jurors visibly pondering her words. Vivian watched Maya closely, impressed by her ability to sow doubt without resorting to theatrics. Maya's next move was to challenge the reliability of the police investigation. She called attention to the lack of forensic evidence tying Daniel to the crime scene and the procedural errors made during his arrest. It became clear that Officer Grayson, who had been quick to label Daniel a suspect, had failed to follow several critical protocols. By the end of the day, the courtroom's energy had shifted. Where once there was an air of certainty about Daniel's guilt, there now hung a palpable uncertainty. Vivian could feel it, like a current running through the room. As she adjourned the session, her eyes lingered on Daniel. His expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hope he didn't dare fully embrace. Vivian exhaled deeply, the weight of the case pressing down on her. She couldn't ignore the growing doubt in her mind, a whisper that perhaps the boy she once knew was still there, a good man now trapped in an unjust system. The courtroom buzzed with a tense energy as Maya Thompson called her next witness to the stand, Officer Paul Grayson, the arresting officer. Grayson was a large man with a stern demeanor, the kind of person who exuded authority simply by walking into a room. He approached the stand with the confidence of someone who had been through this process countless times. Maya began her questioning carefully, her tone even and professional. Officer Grayson, can you walk us through the events that led to Mr. Rivers' arrest? Grayson cleared his throat. We received a call about a robbery at Johnson's grocery. The suspect was described as a black male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a red hoodie. I was patrolling the area nearby and spotted Mr. Rivers walking along Jefferson Avenue, about 3 blocks from the store. And what made you decide to stop and question him? Maya asked, her voice calm but pointed. Grayson's gaze shifted slightly. He matched the description we were given. Maya tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. Matched the description? Officer, are you aware of how many black men in this city are approximately 6 feet tall? The prosecutor objected, but the judge overruled, allowing Maya to continue. Officer Grayson, she said, her voice firm now, did you see Mr. Rivers wearing a red hoodie when you stopped him? Grayson hesitated, his composure faltering for the first time. No, but, Maya seized the opportunity. So, you stopped Mr. Rivers based solely on his race and approximate height. Is that correct? No, Grayson said defensively. It was a combination of factors. Let's discuss those factors, Maya pressed, stepping closer to the witness stand. Did you search for additional evidence, like the red hoodie or the knife supposedly used in the robbery? Grayson shifted in his seat. No, but we had probable cause to arrest him based on the description. Probable cause? Maya's voice sharpened. Or was it an assumption based on stereotypes? The courtroom was silent, the tension almost tangible. Vivian watched closely, her judicial mask firmly in place, but inside she felt a pang of discomfort. Maya was exposing cracks in the investigation, and those cracks were impossible to ignore. Maya turned back to the jury. This is not about thorough police work. This is about convenience. Mr. Rivers was nearby. He fit a vague description, and that was enough for the police to arrest him. But is that enough for you to convict him? The defense's momentum continued as Maya called her next witness, a forensic analyst who had reviewed the surveillance footage and other evidence in the case. The analyst was a petite woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, the type who seemed immune to intimidation. Miss Carter, Maya began, addressing the analyst, you've reviewed the surveillance footage from Johnson's grocery. Can you tell us about your findings? Carter nodded. The footage is grainy and lacks sufficient resolution to clearly identify the suspect. While the figure in the video is wearing a hoodie, their facial features are indistinguishable. Maya held up a printed still from the footage. Is there anything in this image that definitively ties my client to the crime? No, Carter replied without hesitation. And what about the timestamps on the footage? Maya continued. The analyst's expression grew serious. There are discrepancies in the timestamps. They appear to have been altered, which raises questions about the footage's reliability. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Vivian rapped her gavel lightly to restore order, but even she couldn't ignore the growing unease in the room. Maya's questioning shifted to the lack of physical evidence. Miss Carter, was any forensic evidence, fingerprints, DNA, anything, found at the scene that ties Mr. Rivers to this robbery? No, the analyst confirmed. There is no physical evidence linking Mr. Rivers to the crime scene. Maya turned to the jury, her voice steady and compelling. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is built on assumptions, circumstantial evidence, and a botched investigation. The prosecution wants you to convict a man based on shadows and stereotypes, but justice demands more. It demands truth, not convenient narratives. Vivian glanced at Daniel, who sat quietly at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. For the first time, a flicker of hope crossed his face. As the session ended for the day, the weight of doubt hung heavily in the air. The prosecution's case, once seemingly airtight, now appeared riddled with holes. And for Vivian, the cracks in the evidence mirrored the fractures in her own certainty. She couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel wasn't just a defendant. He was a man trapped in a system that had failed him. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric as the defense called Daniel Rivers to the stand. The murmurs in the gallery subsided into tense silence, every eye fixed on him as he rose from his seat. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, Daniel's presence was calm yet commanding, his movements deliberate as he made his way to the witness stand. Maya approached him, her tone measured and steady. Mr. Rivers, thank you for agreeing to testify. Can you tell the court about your life leading up to this moment? Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Maya. I grew up in this city, in the Eastview neighborhood, he began, his voice deep but steady. It wasn't easy. My mom worked 2 jobs to keep us fed. My dad wasn't around. I tried to stay out of trouble, but trouble has a way of finding you when you look like me and grow up where I did. Vivian Hayes listened intently, her face a mask of judicial neutrality, but her heart was a storm of emotion. She couldn't reconcile the man before her with the boy she had known, yet every word he spoke carried an undeniable ring of truth. Maya nodded encouragingly. Mr. Rivers, let's talk about the night of the robbery. Where were you on August 14th? I was at home, Daniel replied firmly. I was watching TV and waiting for my girlfriend to come back from work. She got home around 9:30 and we had dinner together. I didn't leave the apartment that night. Maya turned to the jury. So, you're saying you were nowhere near Johnson's grocery on the night in question? That's correct, Daniel said. The prosecutor rose to object. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant has no alibi to substantiate his claim. Maya countered swiftly. His girlfriend is on the witness list and can corroborate his story. The prosecution is grasping at straws. Vivian rapped her gavel. Sustained. The jury will disregard the prosecution's comment. Maya turned back to Daniel, her voice softening. Mr. Rivers, how has this accusation affected you? Daniel paused, visibly gathering his thoughts. His voice broke slightly as he began to speak. It's been hell. I've lost my job. My neighbors look at me like I'm a criminal, and my family, my mom, she doesn't deserve this. I'm tired of being guilty in people's eyes just because of who I am and where I come from. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Even the prosecutor seemed momentarily subdued. Maya stepped closer. Mr. Rivers, is there anything else you'd like to say to the jury? Daniel looked directly at the 12 men and women who held his fate in their hands. I've made mistakes in my life, but I didn't do this. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for a fair shot. Look at the evidence, not the assumptions. That's all I want. The trial reached its crescendo with the closing arguments. The prosecutor rose first, his tone firm but persuasive. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, pacing deliberately. This case is not about prejudice or assumptions. It's about facts. The defendant was found near the scene of the crime, and the store clerk identified him as the perpetrator. The surveillance footage may not be perfect, but it aligns with the testimony. Justice requires that we hold Mr. Rivers accountable for his actions. He gestured toward Daniel, his voice rising. We cannot let sympathy cloud our judgment. The law exists to protect us all, and it's clear that the evidence points to one conclusion. Daniel Rivers is guilty. The prosecutor sat down, his words hanging in the air like a weight. Maya rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She faced the jury with a calm yet unyielding expression. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady. The prosecution wants you to believe that this case is straightforward, but it's not. They've asked you to convict a man based on incomplete evidence, unreliable testimony, and preconceived notions. They've asked you to ignore the gaps, the discrepancies, and the lack of forensic proof. She walked toward the jury, her eyes meeting theirs one by one. The prosecution's case relies on a single blurry image and the word of a scared young man who admitted he wasn't sure of what he saw. Is that enough to condemn a man? Is that justice? Maya's voice softened. Daniel Rivers is not just a defendant. He's a son, a brother, a partner. He's a man who has fought to rise above his circumstances, only to be dragged down by a system that too often assumes guilt before innocence. She gestured toward the surveillance footage displayed on the monitor. This video is not proof. It's a shadow, and shadows are not enough to take away a man's freedom. Maya turned back to the jury, her final words cutting through the silence like a blade. You have the power to decide what justice looks like. Don't let assumptions make that decision for you. Look at the evidence, or the lack of it, and make the choice that aligns with truth. She returned to her seat, her expression calm but resolute. As Vivian adjourned the court for deliberation, the tension in the room was palpable. Every face was a portrait of uncertainty, every heart weighed down by the enormity of the decision ahead. For Vivian, the trial had become more than a question of guilt or innocence. It was a mirror reflecting the deep flaws in the system she had sworn to uphold, forcing her to confront not only Daniel's fate, but her own role in shaping it. The courtroom was hushed as the jury filed back in, their expressions unreadable. The deliberations had taken hours, but to Daniel Rivers, it felt like an eternity. His hands rested on the defense table, trembling slightly, as Maya placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Across the room, Judge Vivian Hayes maintained her composure, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Vivian asked, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a firm posture, rose and held a folded piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor." Vivian nodded, gesturing for the paper to be handed to her. She unfolded it, scanning the words quickly before returning it to the foreperson. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson cleared her throat, her voice steady but carrying an edge of tension. "In the case of the People v's Daniel Rivers on the charge of robbery, we find the defendant not guilty." For a split second, the room was silent. Then, the gallery erupted into a mixture of gasps, cheers, and muffled cries. Daniel exhaled sharply, as though he'd been holding his breath the entire trial. His head dropped into his hands, and his shoulders shook with relief. Maya smiled warmly, giving his arm a supportive squeeze. Vivian rapped her gavel, her voice cutting through the noise. "Order in the court!" As the room quieted, she addressed the jury. "The court thanks you for your service. You are dismissed." Turning to Daniel, her voice softened just slightly. "Mr. Rivers, you are free to go." The words hung in the air, their significance sinking in slowly. Daniel rose from his seat, his eyes brimming with emotion. For the first time, he looked directly at Vivian, his expression a complicated mix of gratitude, disbelief, and something she couldn't quite name. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving Vivian alone at the bench. She sat back in her chair, the gavel still in her hand, staring at the now empty defense table. The trial was over, but the questions it raised lingered, unresolved. The cracks in the system, the assumptions about race and guilt, and the weight of her role as a judge, they all remained, like shadows that refused to fade. She exhaled deeply, closing her eyes for a moment. It had been a trial that had shaken her, a case that had pushed her to the limits of her understanding of justice. And as she gazed at the empty courtroom, she realized that her work was far from over. This trial might have ended, but the fight for true justice was just beginning. As the last of the reporters filed out of the courtroom, Daniel lingered near the door, waiting. When Vivian finally descended from the bench, their eyes met, and for a moment, the years melted away. He saw the girl he had once called his best friend, and she saw the boy who had shared her dreams of escaping Hammond. "Judge Hayes," Daniel said, his tone respectful but with an edge of familiarity. "Can I have a word?" Vivian hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." They stepped into the judge's chambers, the space quiet and private. Vivian gestured for Daniel to sit, but he remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest. "I didn't expect to see you here," he began, his voice low but steady. "Not like this." Vivian clasped her hands in front of her, her judicial composure faltering slightly. "I didn't expect it either, Daniel, but I had to remain impartial. You understand that, don't you?" He nodded slowly, though his eyes betrayed lingering frustration. "Impartial? Sure, but you knew who I was the moment you saw me, didn't you?" "Yes," she admitted, her voice soft. "I knew." "Then why didn't you say anything? Not even a word?" Vivian sighed, sitting down behind her desk. "Because I couldn't. The minute I acknowledged our past, I would have had to recuse myself. And if I did, I couldn't ensure you got a fair trial." Daniel's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Fair trial? You think that's what this was? I was accused because I happened to be in the wrong place, wearing the wrong skin. If Maya hadn't been relentless, I'd be in a cell right now. Fair doesn't exist for people like me, Vivian." His words cut deeply, and Vivian looked away, ashamed. "You're right," she said quietly. "The system failed you, and it's failed so many others. I see it every day. And yet, I stayed silent. I thought staying impartial was enough, but it's not." Daniel leaned against the desk, his tone softening. "We grew up dreaming of getting out, of making things better. I didn't think I'd end up here, fighting just to prove I'm not a criminal. And I sure didn't think I'd see you, sitting there, deciding whether I deserved my freedom. Vivian met his gaze, her eyes brimming with regret. I never stopped believing in those dreams, Daniel, but I've lost sight of what they meant. Today reminded me. Watching you fight, seeing the cracks in this system, it's made me realize I need to do more than just uphold the law. I need to change it. Daniel straightened, his expression softening further. Then do it, because there are so many more like me, stuck in a system that doesn't see them. Don't let this trial be just another case, Vivian. Make it mean something. She nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. I will. I promise. As Daniel turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back. For what it's worth, you did right by me. Thank you. Vivian sat alone in her chambers long after he was gone, her mind racing. The trial had exposed more than just the flaws in the case. It had exposed the flaws in her own understanding of justice. She vowed to do better, not just for Daniel, but for everyone who came through her courtroom. For the first time in years, Vivian felt a spark of hope. Change was possible, and it would start with her. The courtroom, now empty, seemed larger than ever. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. Judge Vivian Hayes sat alone at her bench, her mind replaying the events of the trial. The sound of Daniel's voice, raw and filled with pain, lingered in her thoughts. His final words, "Make it mean something," echoed like a call to action. For years, Vivian had prided herself on her ability to uphold the law with impartiality, believing that was enough. But Daniel's trial had shaken her foundation. She saw the cracks in the system, the biases that seeped into every corner of justice. For too long, she had turned a blind eye, focusing solely on her role as arbiter without questioning the machinery she was part of. As she walked through the empty halls of the courthouse, her heels clicking softly against the marble, Vivian felt a shift within herself. The trial wasn't just a wake-up call. It was a turning point. Across town, Daniel Rivers stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out at the city. He breathed in the crisp air, feeling the weight of the trial lift slightly from his shoulders. He was free, but the scars of the experience would remain. Maya stood beside him, her arms crossed and a small, victorious smile on her face. You did it, Daniel. You told your story, and they listened. He glanced at her, gratitude shining in his eyes. We did it, Maya. I wouldn't have made it without you. She shrugged, her smile widening. It's my job, but this one meant more. I hope it's the start of something better for you. Daniel nodded, his gaze drifting back to the bustling streets. It has to be. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been in my shoes. As they walked away from the courthouse, Daniel felt a sense of purpose growing within him. This trial was not the end. It was the beginning. He resolved to use his voice and his experience to advocate for others, to fight for those still trapped in the cycle of injustice. Months later, Vivian Hayes stood at a podium in a packed auditorium, addressing an audience of young law students and community leaders. Injustice doesn't always wear a mask, she began, her voice clear and steady. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, within the systems we trust to protect us. As a judge, I believed my duty was to remain impartial, to interpret the law as written. But I've learned that true justice requires more than impartiality. It demands courage, compassion, and the willingness to question the very structures we uphold. She paused, scanning the room. The trial of Daniel Rivers taught me that justice isn't just about verdicts. It's about humanity. It's about listening, understanding, and fighting for those who are unseen and unheard. And as long as I wear this robe, I will dedicate myself not just to interpreting the law, but to challenging the biases within it. The audience erupted into applause, and Vivian stepped back, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had found her purpose again, not just as a judge, but as an agent of change. For Daniel and Vivian, their paths had diverged long ago, but fate had brought them together once more. Their reunion, though painful, had ignited a spark in both of them. One sought to rebuild his life and help others rise above their circumstances. The other vowed to transform the very system that had nearly broken him. And so, their story was no longer one of childhood friends torn apart by prejudice. It became a story of resilience, redemption, and the pursuit of justice, not just for themselves, but for everyone who believed that change was possible. As they moved forward on their separate journeys, both carried the same unshakable truth. One voice, one action, could create ripples of change, and together those ripples could form a wave. Thank you so much for sticking with the story until the end. We hope you felt the message and the transformation within the story. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any future content. We truly appreciate your support. See you in the next story.